Inspector Purbright received the letter on a Tuesday morning, delivered by the rectory's underpaid and over-anxious clerk, whose enthusiasm for punctuality rarely exceeded his knowledge of punctuation. The envelope, penned in a fine but slightly tremulous hand, bore the address of the parish guild. Purbright unfolded it with the habitual care of a man who had long since learned that small towns preferred their anxieties carefully folded, politely bound, and delivered in triplicate. The letter, written by one Mrs. Liddell, expressed a most genteel concern. A song, or perhaps merely a sequence of notes, had been heard emanating from the convent garden at the hour of midnight. "I do not wish to seem alarmist," it concluded, "but the occurrence is causing mild perturbation among the committee members." He made a note in his journal, a small leather-bound volume that had, over the years, collected more ambiguities than certainties. The inspector was not given to overstatement. He recognized the tone immediately. In his experience, a polite expression of alarm in a parish letter almost invariably concealed some combination of minor scandal, personal resentment, and communal guilt. The exact proportions were rarely revealed before the inspector's arrival. He sipped his lukewarm tea, pondering how best to navigate the subtle currents of expectation. By the time he arrived at St. Agnes's Convent, the morning sun had begun to gild the topmost spire with a faintly ecclesiastical glow. The path to the entrance was neat, bordered by clipped hedges and flower beds that might have been arranged by a person of exacting temperament, or perhaps by the spirit of the local committee itself, who had recently insisted on a redesign. Sister Beatrice met him in the cloister, her hands folded with habitual precision. She was a woman of measured grace, her composure suggestive of long hours spent in meditation, reflection, or perhaps silent calculation. "Inspector Purbright," she said, inclining her head slightly, "we are honored by your visit. I hope it is nothing untoward that brings you here so early." "On the contrary," Purbright replied, inclining himself with corresponding civility, "I find that an early visit provides the clearest perspective, both on architecture and rumour." His eyes, however, lingered on the edge of her sleeve and the precise arrangement of the garden beyond. There was nothing untoward in the conventional sense, yet the meticulous order seemed to exert a subtle pressure on the air, as if each petal and leaf were insisting on propriety at the expense of spontaneity. Sister Beatrice led him to the garden gate, where the hedges formed a miniature labyrinth, and the pathways converged with geometrical exactitude. "It is quite true," she admitted, "that I occasionally sing in the garden at night. It is a personal custom." Her voice remained level, almost disarmingly calm. Purbright noted the choice of words, personal custom rather than habit or ritual, a phrasing that implied benign intent while simultaneously shielding her from inquiry. "And the hour?" he asked, in that understated tone which demanded explanation without accusation. She smiled faintly, a smile that suggested both amusement and the possibility of mischief. Midnight is a time when one's thoughts are least encumbered by parish concerns. It is the hour in which one may reflect on both the past day and the duties to come. Purbright nodded. The notion in itself was entirely reasonable, yet the timing coincided, he had been told, with certain parish committee meetings and donor visits, a fact that, while superficially innocent, could not escape the observant eye. He wandered through the garden, noting the arrangement of the flower beds, the deliberate symmetry, and the slight disarray in a corner where a petal had fallen onto a stone pathway. Such minor irregularities were precisely the elements that revealed personality and occasionally disquiet. Returning to the convent hall, he encountered Mrs. Liddell herself, who had insisted upon accompanying the inspector to observe the premises firsthand. She was a woman of impeccable manners, yet her gaze flickered constantly, as though monitoring both Sister Beatrice and the inspector for signs of impropriety. She greeted Purbright with a curtsy that was slightly exaggerated, a detail not lost on him. "I trust that all is in order," she said, voice soft, almost conspiratorial. "But one cannot help noticing that the choir has been somewhat unsettled." "Unsettled?" Purbright prompted, leaning gently on the back of a chair. "Oh, only in minor ways," she replied, eyes darting toward a set of hymnals stacked with fastidious care. There are murmurs of preference, of perceived injustices in scheduling, nothing that cannot be corrected, of course, by a suitably impartial hand. Her phrasing suggested not only concern, but an anticipation that Purbright might validate the latent anxiety she carried for the parish guild. He made no immediate response, allowing the silence to settle, an invisible yet palpable presence. In small towns, he reflected, silence was rarely neutral. It often bore the weight of expectation, judgment, and mild apprehension. A word too quickly offered might either aggravate or placate, and the skill lay in observing the interplay of gestures, glances, and omissions. Later, seated in the convent parlour with a cup of weak tea, Purbright surveyed the gathering of nuns who had been summoned, under Sister Beatrice's guidance, to provide testimony of their nocturnal observations. Each spoke in the same calm, deliberate register, describing the singing in phrases that suggested routine rather than scandal. Yet between the words lay the subtle marks of social friction, the slightly reluctant nods, the imperceptible tension in hand movements, the faint tightening of smiles. One could almost trace the lines of hierarchy and suppressed grievance in the arrangement of chairs alone. "The song is not disturbing," Sister Agnes offered, placing her teacup with careful exactitude, "though perhaps it is noticed more than necessary by the neighbours." Purbright made a mental note. The phrase "noticed more than necessary" contained both a critique and a concealment, a dual function he had encountered often in letters and committee minutes. It hinted at communal anxiety, at the fear that private indulgences might unintentionally illuminate hidden resentments. As the morning wore on, he ventured briefly into the nearby village. He passed the post office where Mrs. Liddell's letter had been dispatched and overheard fragments of polite speculation. Perhaps she is lonely, or has an artistic temperament, or simply desires to impress. Each conjecture, voiced with civility, carried the unmistakable undertone of judgment. In his notebook, Purbright recorded both the content and the cadence of gossip, aware that reputational friction often revealed itself less in words than in their measured delivery. Returning to the convent at mid-morning, he paused at the garden gate. The air was still, the paths immaculate, yet a single fallen petal lay slightly askew, a subtle imperfection in an otherwise ordered world. Purbright found a faint satisfaction in the anomaly. It was a small clue, hardly sufficient to suggest wrongdoing, yet perfectly adequate to hint at intention, deviation, or mild mischief. It occurred to him that this might be the element that linked the nocturnal song, the parish's mild agitation, and the carefully cultivated reputations of all involved. As he took his leave, Sister Beatrice accompanied him to the front door. "You will, of course, record that there is nothing inappropriate," she said softly, the hint of a smile lingering. "We would not wish to burden the committee unduly." Purbright inclined his head. "Naturally, one records facts, Sister Beatrice, not conjecture, though facts may occasionally suggest hypotheses." She allowed the remark to hang in the air, polite and non-committal, as if weighing whether he had truly understood. The inspector stepped onto the path, glanced once more at the meticulously trimmed hedges, and reflected that the midnight song might serve as a mirror rather than a signal, a reflection of communal anxieties, committee rivalries, and private indulgences masquerading as devotions. As he walked back toward his car, the faintest echo of the canticle seemed to follow him across the cloister walls, carried on a breeze neither audible nor insistent, yet undeniably present. He paused for a moment, listening with the attentiveness born of decades spent in observation. The note lingered, haunting not in its sound but in its suggestion, that beneath the polished surfaces of etiquette and civility, a network of minor resentments and delicate pretensions threaded through the parish like a subterranean current. And as Purbright turned the corner onto the village street, he found himself with a single, unspoken question. Was the song the act of a solitary nun, or the silent commentary of an entire community, orchestrated in the small, deliberate ways that only the most polite people understand? With that, the inspector made a mental note to return at the next appointed hour, when the garden would once again be empty, and the canticle, if it persisted, might reveal ever so subtly its true audience. The morning after his initial visit to St. Agnes's, Inspector Purbright settled into his study with the same careful deliberation he afforded his correspondence, a cup of tea cooling beside an orderly stack of parish newsletters. The latest edition, printed with the village crest and a surprisingly ornate font, contained not one but 3 references, deliberately oblique, he suspected, to recent disturbances in convent routines. A paragraph concerning the maintenance of nightly decorum in the cloistered garden drew his attention, the phrasing both courteous and vaguely reproachful. Purbright had learned that such newsletters were rarely innocent. Each sentence, each polite admonition, was a carefully calibrated instrument of social pressure. He began by making a modest chart of correspondence, annotating letters, newsletter items, and snippets of conversation from his previous visit. The network of concern, he noted, extended in concentric circles: immediate convent staff, parish committees, donors, and a small faction of neighbours whose proximity to the cloister afforded them the most morally assertive observations. The inspection of this network, he reflected, was as much a matter of listening as reading. Silence, or the careful avoidance of comment, often carried more weight than any accusation. Purbright's first appointment of the day was a visit to the vicarage, where Reverend Hapgood received him in a room furnished with the gentle pomp of clerical propriety. A heavy oak desk, books stacked with exacting order, and a tapestry depicting a choir of angels, each angel smiling a touch too broadly, as if to suggest moral rectitude at all times. The vicar's manner was measured, a combination of learned civility and faint anxiety. "I fear the committee is, how shall I say, unsettled," the vicar said, pouring tea with precise economy. "They are concerned about the convent's nocturnal activities. Naturally, one does not wish to appear intrusive, yet the reports are persistent." Purbright accepted the cup with minimal ceremony. "Persistent in what sense?" he inquired, his tone deliberately neutral, allowing the vicar to supply the subtleties of discontent. "Merely observed," Hapgood replied, his eyes flicking briefly to a set of ledger books. Footsteps in the garden, glimpses of a solitary figure, the echo of song carried across the wall. Nothing untoward in itself, but when several parishioners remark upon it, a sense of impropriety is suggested. Purbright nodded. The term was precisely what he had anticipated: impropriety, not guilt. It reflected communal anxiety, the delicate fear that any deviation from routine, even if perfectly innocent, might undermine the carefully maintained hierarchy of reputation. He made a note in his journal, perception outweighs reality. Reputation, rather than act, governs concern. After a courteous discussion of minor parish finances and choir schedules, Purbright took his leave. The vicar escorted him to the gate, where the morning sun struck the stone path in patterns reminiscent of stained glass, casting faintly moral shadows. "Do remind the committee," Hapgood said, voice softening, "that our intentions are entirely honourable. One hopes that observation will not become suspicion." The inspector's next call was upon Mrs. Liddell, the guild secretary, who resided in a house that seemed itself to have been arranged in anticipation of polite scrutiny. Furniture was placed symmetrically, the lace curtains starched into formal attention, and the tea-tray polished as though it might at any moment be evaluated by an unseen auditor. Mrs. Liddell welcomed him with a measured curtsy, her smile a blend of civility and gentle triumph. She clearly considered herself the moral custodian of the parish. "Inspector," she said, placing a dainty hand upon a cup, "I trust your investigations are proceeding as one might hope. We are, of course, anxious, though I assure you our concern is entirely disinterested." Purbright inclined his head. "I understand entirely, Mrs. Liddell, and yet even disinterested concern may shape behaviour. One might observe a pattern even in what is meant to be incidental." Her eyes, a pale grey of faint calculation, regarded him steadily. "Indeed, it is the pattern that troubles us. Not the song itself, for who could object to a nun's devotion, but the timing and the impression it leaves. The committee fears, I believe, that appearances may suggest indulgence or preference." "Preference?" Purbright prompted. "Yes," she murmured, lowering her voice. "The convent is a microcosm. Even minor attention, such as a late-night rehearsal, may be interpreted as favoritism. The young nuns are diligent, yet some appear perturbed or perhaps envious. It is difficult to say which." She offered a faint, fleeting smile, as though sharing a private puzzle with him. Purbright noted the subtle deflection. Envy and social anxiety, rather than any deliberate impropriety, were likely the engine's driving concern. He accepted her description of committee meetings, noting the oblique phrasing in minutes that spoke more of attentive oversight than direct observation. The subtext, he observed, was social accountability, a quiet pressure to conform to expectation, enforced not by law, but by collective vigilance. His afternoon was occupied with the parish library, where correspondence and archival newsletters were stored in meticulous order. Letters from concerned parishioners described in polite but unmistakable tones the echo of the midnight song. "We hope it is merely a passing fancy," one read, "though we trust the committee will exercise discreet guidance." Another praised Sister Beatrice's musical devotion, while hinting that her schedule might conflict with committee priorities. Purbright recognized the literary equivalent of eyebrow-raising, each sentence carefully calibrated to imply concern without overt accusation. A particularly interesting note from a retired schoolmaster revealed a pattern. The nocturnal singing coincided with committee meetings or donor visits, almost as if the song were a private commentary upon civic ritual. The inspector, absorbing the subtlety, allowed himself a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The town, he concluded, had elevated a solitary musical act into a mirror reflecting its own minor anxieties. As evening approached, he returned to the convent under the pretext of additional observation. The garden, deserted now, retained the faint perfume of early blooms and a few petals scattered in near-perfect alignment. Sister Beatrice emerged to greet him at the gate, the setting sun casting a delicate halo upon her carefully arranged habit. "Inspector," she said, "you are vigilant beyond necessity. Yet one must admire the devotion to one's duties." "Devotion," Purbright replied, "can be observed in many ways, even in the care of a flower bed or the timing of a song." She inclined her head, acknowledging his point without conceding anything. The inspector, in turn, allowed a moment of quiet reflection, noting the subtle tension in her posture, a balance between reassurance and deliberate control. He began to perceive with measured clarity that the song's significance lay not solely in its melody, but in its reception. The convent's social and psychological landscape, he realized, was as carefully cultivated as the garden itself. A final observation occupied him as he prepared to leave, a faint disturbance in the dew upon the stone pathway, a single footprint slightly offset from the neatly arranged tiles. It was too slight, too deliberate, to suggest clumsiness, and yet entirely insufficient to indicate intrusion. Purbright recorded it in his mind as a marker, a subtle trace of intention, perhaps the only signature of the canticle's performer. Walking back through the village under the early dusk, he noticed that the townspeople moved with the polite restraint characteristic of small communities. Greetings were exchanged with measured warmth, glances were fleeting, and commentary was hedged with multiple qualifiers. Each citizen, in his observation, seemed to participate in a quiet theatre of civility, aware of reputations both fragile and sacred. Purbright, reflecting on the day's findings, concluded that the midnight song was less an act to be judged and more a signal to be interpreted, a nuanced commentary upon the town's minor resentments, its hierarchy of attention, and the persistent anxiety that even innocuous deviation might provoke. The interplay of social expectation and private devotion formed a subtle tension, almost invisible, yet profoundly indicative of the parish's character. As he settled in for the night, the inspector's thoughts lingered upon a single question, unspoken but persistent. Was Sister Beatrice performing solely for her own reflection, or had the canticle, through the delicate agency of pattern and timing, become a silent instrument of observation, revealing not her intentions, but those of the community itself? The thought, tentative yet insistent, hovered as he penned his notes, a small shift that promised to guide his next visit. By mid-morning, Inspector Purbright found himself walking the short distance to the convent, under the impression, half amused, that he had been summoned by a collective nervousness more than any pressing emergency. The sun had broken through a thin mist, illuminating the neatly trimmed hedges and the immaculate garden paths, and in that clarity, every leaf and flower seemed to carry its own suggestion of propriety. Purbright reflected that in a small town, nothing escapes observation, least of all the minutiae of ritual and habit. Even a solitary song repeated nightly might acquire a weight it never possessed in the performer's mind. He was admitted promptly by Sister Beatrice, who greeted him with the customary composure, her hands folded in front of her, the corners of her mouth hinting at the faintest acknowledgment of the inspector's presence. "Inspector," she said, her voice calm yet deliberate, "we have taken the liberty of assembling a few members of the junior choir. I understand you wished to speak with them." "Indeed," Purbright replied, inclining his head. "To understand the full scope of perceptions rather than merely the facts." He had learned that perception often exerted far more influence than objective events, particularly in communities where reputations were treated with the utmost delicacy. The choir, small and arranged with disciplined symmetry on a series of narrow benches, greeted him with polite bows and carefully controlled expressions. Their eyes flickered between one another, Sister Beatrice and Purbright, as though each glance required approval from some unseen arbiter. The inspector seated himself at the end of the front row, allowing the young women to adjust their postures with a precision that suggested both anticipation and restraint. "Miss Calendar," he began, addressing the eldest of the junior nuns, "could you describe the nature of these nocturnal songs? Your observations, I mean, rather than conjecture?" Miss Calendar inclined her head, her hands folded neatly in her lap. They are, of course, entirely voluntary. Sister Beatrice sometimes sings in the garden after the final vespers. One hears her from the cloister if the wind carries it, and it is rather beautiful, though unexpected. Her phrasing was deliberate, carefully neutral, yet Purbright detected a faint undercurrent of hesitation, the invisible shadow of mild resentment. "Unexpected?" he prompted, in the tone of a man noting a curious inconsistency. "Yes, sir," she said softly. "It is unusual for such activity to occur after the convent's lights are extinguished. Some of us find it disconcerting, though we would never say so openly. We understand the importance of decorum." The inspector observed the subtle interplay of phrasing and omission. "Disconcerting," he noted silently, "is here a proxy for irritation, perhaps even envy." He allowed a brief pause, letting the word float between them. In small communities, silence was seldom idle. It carried an immense weight, capable of revealing factional alliances or personal grievances. Another junior nun, Miss Faraday, spoke next. Her voice was pitched slightly higher, carrying a tentative, formal precision. "It is, not merely the hour, sir. Sometimes the melody aligns, perhaps inadvertently, with parish events, and one cannot help but notice that its timing seems significant." She glanced at her companions, eyes briefly meeting Miss Calendar's before dropping. "I mean, we are all devoted, of course, but the coincidence is observed." Purbright's attention sharpened. A coincidence, phrased with such care, often suggested intention. He made a discreet note. "The song's timing may serve as commentary, intentional or otherwise, upon social rituals beyond the convent walls." He permitted himself the smallest smile. The subtlety of human calculation never ceased to amuse him. "What do you mean by observed?" he asked gently, aware that his phrasing could elicit more than a direct answer. "It is?" Miss Faraday hesitated. "A matter of perception, sir. One perceives the community's response, the gentle disquiet, the polite whispers. It seems to highlight what is expected of us, even when none intends to impose." Purbright inclined his head. Indeed, the young nun had captured the essence of the dilemma. Perception, subtly amplified by silence, functioned as a means of social enforcement. He had encountered such phenomena before, though rarely articulated so candidly. Sister Beatrice, standing a discreet distance away, made no intervention, yet her composed posture suggested both awareness and approval. Purbright noted that her calm observation encouraged candor while simultaneously preserving hierarchical authority. It was, he reflected, a careful negotiation between disclosure and discretion, and one that the community beyond the convent walls might interpret in a multitude of ways. "Has the song ever caused actual disruption?" he asked, his tone lightly questioning. "No, sir," Miss Calendar replied, eyes briefly flicking toward her peers. "Only minor distraction. Some prefer to retire immediately, others linger at study desks. There is no impropriety, yet the sensation of being watched, or of audience, is difficult to explain. It is, perhaps, a commentary of its own." The inspector allowed the silence to settle, as if permitting the words to resonate beyond their literal meaning. In small towns, commentary often took the form of ritualized acts rather than overt statements. A midnight song, a carefully phrased letter, a committee observation, all could serve to expose latent hierarchies, unspoken preferences, or subtle resentments. After the interviews, Purbright took a short walk in the convent garden, observing the paths, the neat flower beds, and the carefully raked gravel. The young nuns had mentioned that the song seemed to follow an unspoken schedule, coinciding with parish gatherings, committee meetings, and occasional donor visits. He considered the implication. What began as private devotion might simultaneously serve as a lens through which community tensions became visible. He paused near a border of hyacinths, noting a slight disarray in the placement of petals that suggested recent disturbance. Nothing scandalous, merely a detail that hinted at human intervention. The inspector reflected that in such environments, meaning often resided not in grand gestures, but in these minute irregularities. He was reminded again that small towns cultivated observation with as much care as gardens. Every footprint, every note carried significance. Returning to the parlour, he found Sister Beatrice quietly arranging hymnals, each aligned with geometric precision. "You have gathered much insight," she said softly, without turning. "Do you believe that the young nun's observations reflect reality, or merely the anxieties of perception?" Purbright allowed a faint smile to play across his features. "It is rarely one or the other, Sister Beatrice. Often, perception shapes reality, and the weight of reputation governs conduct more than any rule or regulation." He permitted the remark to linger, noting her subtle acknowledgement, a slight tilt of the head, a careful stillness that suggested understanding without concession. Later, he wandered back along the cloister, reflecting on the interviews and observations. The young nun's cautious remarks had revealed minor fractures, mild envy, the anticipation of scrutiny, and the unspoken desire for recognition. Yet none admitted to feeling truly disturbed by the song itself. The unrest was largely social, psychological, and reputational. The canticle, in its gentle persistence, had become a medium for expressing communal tension, a mirror rather than a challenge. As evening approached, Purbright paused at the garden gate, noting a new detail he had not observed in the morning. A faint impression in the gravel near the rose trellis, as if a single figure had paused deliberately, not to trample but to position, to observe, or perhaps to mark the occasion. It was insignificant in isolation, yet within the context of timing, perception, and subtle community anxiety, it acquired a quiet weight. Walking back toward the village street, the inspector considered the delicate architecture of social vigilance he had encountered. Letters, committee minutes, polite gossip, and midnight songs, each was a small instrument of observation, reinforcing norms and exposing latent discomforts. The townspeople's careful attention to manners, appearances, and moral propriety shaped both individual behavior and communal perception. And then, as he passed beneath the faint glow of the street lamps, Purbright registered the smallest curiosity. A single window in the convent upper story slightly ajar, a shadow moving within. He did not presume its significance, yet the observation lingered, a silent question hovering on the periphery of awareness. Had the midnight song and the careful observation of it become more than commentary, perhaps a subtle signal, intended for someone, or merely a reflection of attentiveness so exact that even the smallest gesture mattered? With that he made his way home, the evening air crisp and suffused with the faint scent of hyacinths. The canticle, he reflected, had revealed less about transgression and more about the intricate machinery of perception, envy, and subtle moral scrutiny in a community exquisitely attuned to its own proprieties. A single footprint, a tentative glance, a cautious confession. These were the instruments through which the parish's conscience, ever vigilant, conducted its quiet inquiry. Purbright retired to his study, recording his observations with care. The faint impression in the gravel, the shadow in the upper window, and the patterns of attention among the junior choir now coalesced into a tentative hypothesis that the canticle, persistent yet unobtrusive, functioned simultaneously as ritual, commentary, and mirror. The question remained, unspoken yet insistent, and he allowed it to guide his thoughts into the night. Whose conscience, exactly, was the song illuminating? The following morning, Inspector Purbright found himself summoned to the parish hall, a modest building whose exterior denoted careful maintenance and interior deliberation. The hall was host on this occasion to a meeting of the parish committee, convened to discuss the canticle, or, as the minutes delicately phrased it, nocturnal occurrences of musical nature in the convent grounds. Purbright had learned over many years that committees of this sort functioned as both observation post and moral barometer. Every word uttered, every nod or hesitation, signalled far more than the ostensible business at hand. He was greeted at the door by Mrs. Liddell, who seemed simultaneously relieved and tense at his presence. "Inspector," she said, inclining with practised precision, "your attendance is, of course, most welcome. The committee was growing, shall I say, restive." The choice of words struck Purbright as intentionally understated. In his experience, restiveness often concealed a combination of envy, unacknowledged grievance, and a desire for social oversight. Inside, the committee members were assembled in 2 neat rows of chairs, their posture reflecting an ingrained consciousness of decorum. The vicar presided from a central seat, his hands folded upon the polished oak table, eyes surveying the room with a quiet authority that contrasted sharply with the visible apprehension of some of his associates. Purbright noted, without surprise, that the discussion began in formal tones, polite and circuitous, avoiding direct accusation, but suffused with implication. "It has been observed," began Mr. Threlfall, the treasurer, carefully adjusting his spectacles, "that musical activity during the late hours may perhaps inadvertently disrupt the usual rhythm of parish life." His phrasing was exquisite in its neutrality, yet Purbright detected the faint undercurrent of moral concern, a hope that someone else might vocalize the implicit judgment. "Yes," said Mrs. Liddell, "one does not wish to impugn the good intentions of the convent, yet it is difficult to ignore impressions when they are noted by multiple observers. The committee has a responsibility, after all, to maintain propriety." Her words were deliberate. She had studied each syllable, calibrating offence against duty, concern against civility. Purbright inclined his head. "I am here to understand the perception as much as the facts," he said, his tone soft yet exacting. "It seems the committee's awareness is acute and its sense of responsibility commendable. Yet one must ask whether perception, amplified through repeated observation, has become itself a form of pressure." The room fell silent, though not uncomfortably so. Silence in such circumstances functioned as commentary. It allowed each member to reflect upon their own position, their personal anxieties, and the manner in which polite scrutiny might be interpreted by others. Purbright noted the subtle shuffling of papers, the brief glances exchanged between Mrs. Liddell and Mr. Threlfall, the slight tightening of lips among the newer members of the committee. "It is not merely the hour," Mr. Whitcomb, a retired solicitor, contributed, voice measured and precise, "but the coincidence of these occurrences with parish events. One might speculate, without intending discourtesy, that the timing is conspicuous." He paused, allowing the word to rest, not as accusation but as an observation, the kind of indirect commentary small towns excel at cultivating. Purbright observed that the language of speculation served multiple purposes. It signalled concern, maintained politeness, and preserved deniability. The speaker, having uttered suspicion, could retreat behind formality, leaving the listener to interpret nuance. In a small community, he reflected, such linguistic craftsmanship was as potent as any ordinance. Mrs. Liddell, encouraged by the solicitor's remark, leaned forward slightly. "The choir has mentioned distraction, though none wishes to complain openly. Yet the suggestion lingers as a matter of conscience. One cannot ignore the subtle anxieties it produces. Her voice was quiet but firm, carrying authority derived from both office and propriety. "I see," Purbright said, allowing the note of inquiry to linger. "It appears that the canticle's significance is in part its reflection upon social expectations, its subtle illumination of anxieties that otherwise remain unspoken." He allowed his gaze to rest briefly upon each committee member, noting the minor alterations in posture, a hand tightening around a pen, a shoulder drawn slightly back, a fleeting glance at a neighbour as though seeking validation. The vicar cleared his throat, a faintly disapproving but polite gesture. "One must balance vigilance with understanding. The convent's intentions are manifestly honourable. Yet perception is not without influence. Perhaps a review of schedules, visits, and community engagement would provide clarity." His words were measured, maintaining authority without confrontation. Purbright inclined his head, noting the duality inherent in the statement, an acknowledgement of propriety and a recognition that human observation, even when intended kindly, could produce subtle consequences. The canticle, he thought, had become less a private act than a mirror held to the community, reflecting its own anxieties, rivalries, and minor resentments. After a period of discussion, the inspector requested to review the committee's notes and correspondence. They were presented in neat folders, each document displaying characteristic politeness, careful phrasing, avoidance of direct accusation, yet persistent attention to perceived irregularities. He noted that the letters from parishioners were suffused with oblique concern, implying observation without overt judgment. One paragraph mentioned the ethereal quality of the midnight melody, followed by a polite suggestion that it might benefit from occasional temporal adjustment, a phrase designed, as he observed, to admonish without offence. He spent some time examining the minutiae, the consistent spacing of ink on paper, the occasional underlined word, and the deliberate repetition of certain phrases. Each subtle emphasis, he realized, was a carefully calibrated instrument deployed to communicate unease, to assert moral vigilance, and to maintain hierarchical awareness. Small communities, he reflected, were profoundly adept at these forms of silent governance. During a brief interlude, Purbright stepped into the corridor and observed the hall's windows, through which the convent garden was visible in the distance. A faint shimmer of sunlight illuminated a section of path that bore a slight irregularity, a displaced stone, subtle yet suggestive of movement. He made a mental note. Patterns of attention, both from within the convent and from beyond, seemed to intersect precisely at these moments of minor disruption. The canticle, though silent at present, had left traces, deliberate or otherwise, that could be read by the attentive eye. Returning to the committee, he asked a final, carefully phrased question. "Do any among you believe that the song itself is troublesome, or is it rather the reflection it provokes?" The question, framed without accusation, allowed each member to confront both their own perceptions and the communal implications. Mrs. Liddell responded first with her habitual composure. "It is never the song itself, Inspector. We admire Sister Beatrice's devotion, yet it brings into relief certain patterns of attention and expectation, minor rivalries, loyalties, and unspoken judgments. These are the truths that give pause." Her eyes met his, conveying the precision of her observation. The canticle had become, unintentionally, a vehicle for the community's self-examination. The meeting concluded with customary civility, committee members rising in orderly sequence, exchanging measured farewells. Purbright noted with dry amusement how the ritual of departure mirrored the ritual of observation, deliberate, precise, and charged with subtle meaning. He had arrived to observe a nocturnal song. He departed having witnessed the quiet architecture of communal conscience. Outside, as he walked toward the convent garden for his final inspection, Purbright allowed a moment of reflection. The canticle's significance extended beyond melody or timing. It had become a focal point for social tension, a reflection of reputational anxiety, and a lens through which minor hypocrisies were magnified. The careful observation of committee members, letters, and whispered commentary had revealed a landscape rich in psychological nuance, in which civility itself functioned as both safeguard and instrument of subtle pressure. Near the rose trellis, he noticed another minor anomaly, a leaf slightly out of place, a small indentation in the soil, and a faint scent of disturbed lavender. Each was insufficient to indicate mischief, yet together they hinted at deliberate attention, as though someone had moved through the garden with consciousness of being observed, or perhaps with the intent to be observed. Purbright's interest sharpened. Was this merely the act of habitual care, or had the canticle's performer, intentional or not, begun to acknowledge the community's gaze? He paused at the garden gate, the evening light now soft and diffuse. The inspector noted the faintest whisper of wind stirring the flowers, carrying with it a sense of delicate anticipation. It seemed in that moment that the midnight song might hold not only melody, but subtle commentary, a quiet signal encoded in timing, pattern, and perception. The community, he reflected, was as much performer as audience, its anxieties articulated in glances, letters, and minutes, all refracted through the prism of social expectation. Purbright made his way along the cloister, pausing briefly to observe the convent windows. One, uppermost and slightly ajar, revealed a shadow shifting against the dim glow of lamplight. He did not presume significance, yet the observation lingered, quiet and persistent, a question hovering just beyond articulation. Whose conscience, or whose awareness, was truly illuminated by the canticle, and what subtle designs, if any, guided its timing? As he departed, the inspector allowed himself a faint, dryly amused smile. In small towns, he reflected, intrigue rarely announces itself with dramatic flourish. It is encoded in civility, in over-careful observation, and in the tiny, almost imperceptible displacements of ordinary life. The canticle, he suspected, was as much a reflection of the community as a creation of the convent. And now, armed with the committee's testimony, the minutiae of observation, and the faintest traces in the garden, he possessed the beginning of a map for decoding it. The chapter closed with a subtle, persistent question lingering in his mind. Had the midnight song merely mirrored the parish's anxieties, or was it an active, deliberate commentary aimed at revealing, perhaps gently chiding, the hypocrisies and rivalries that had lain dormant under a veneer of civility? Inspector Purbright arrived at St. Agnes's convent shortly after dawn, the air crisp with a faint mist that softened the edges of the hedges and flower beds. Morning light revealed subtleties invisible in the afternoon, the dew clinging to petals, the faint indentation of a footfall in gravel, and the gentle tilt of a trellis post suggesting careful adjustment rather than accident. The garden, as always, was immaculate, yet to Purbright's practised eye, no arrangement was so perfect as to conceal human presence. A single petal displaced by the night, a leaf slightly askew, each whispered of intention or observation, of the precise choreography required to maintain the balance between order and discretion. Sister Beatrice emerged from the convent doorway, her hands folded as always, her expression composed yet hinting at quiet amusement. "Inspector," she said, voice level, "you honour us with an early visit. I trust the morning finds you well?" "Indeed," Purbright replied, inclining his head, "though I confess I find the garden far more instructive in early light than at any other hour. Subtle details reveal themselves to the patient observer." She allowed a faint nod, neither inviting nor discouraging further observation. The inspector noted the calm authority with which she managed the space. Her presence seemed to mark boundaries without intrusion, to impose order without drawing attention. Walking slowly along the gravel path, he noted the careful alignment of roses, each bloom turned deliberately toward the sun, yet one corner of the garden bore a slight irregularity. The soil was slightly compacted, a faint impression of a shoe's heel suggesting recent passage. Nothing scandalous, of course, but indicative of deliberate activity. Purbright made a mental note. The garden, like the convent itself, functioned as a medium of expression, each shift and misalignment potentially laden with significance. A sudden movement drew his attention. Sister Agnes appeared at the edge of the rose trellis carrying a small watering can. She paused mid-step, seemingly uncertain whether she should continue or defer to the inspector's scrutiny. Purbright inclined his head lightly, allowing her the dignity of choice. She resumed her task with the quiet precision characteristic of her order, yet he observed a brief flicker of tension in her shoulders, as though the act of tending flowers in the open revealed more than mere horticultural care. "Morning, Sister Agnes," he said softly. "Does the garden yield many insights at this hour?" She glanced up, eyes careful and measured. "It is revealing, sir. One notices patterns, minor disturbances, slight shifts in arrangement. Nothing alarming, yet sufficient to suggest attention has been paid by someone." Purbright allowed a small, nearly imperceptible smile. The words confirmed his suspicion. The nocturnal song and the attendant movements were intertwined with deliberate observation. The convent itself, he noted, seemed to participate in the subtle choreography, a silent commentary upon both duty and perception. He continued his inspection, noting the paths where dew had been slightly displaced, the areas where petals had been deliberately brushed aside. Each anomaly, insignificant in isolation, formed a pattern, one of vigilance, of intent, and perhaps of communication. He recalled the committee's previous observations, their polite anxiety, the careful phrasing of letters and minutes. The nocturnal canticle was no longer merely an auditory event. It had become embedded in the very soil, the very rhythm of the convent, and the attentiveness of its inhabitants. Sister Beatrice approached quietly, her steps measured, and gestured toward a small bench beneath a magnolia tree. "Many choose this spot for reflection," she said, her tone neutral. "It provides an unobstructed view of the garden and the horizon beyond. One may observe without being observed." Purbright inclined his head and seated himself, noting the subtle play of light across the blooms and the faint scent of lavender and rosemary. "Observation," he said softly, "seems to be a theme of this place, Sister Beatrice. Not only of the garden, but perhaps of those beyond its walls." She said nothing, allowing the statement to linger. Her silence, like the precise arrangement of the hedges, was itself meaningful, neither confirmation nor denial, but a subtle signal that the observer's role was acknowledged and understood. A young nun, Sister Margaret, approached with a basket of freshly gathered herbs. Her steps were careful, her glance fleeting, toward the inspector, as if measuring the propriety of her movements. She paused near the magnolia bench, setting down the basket with delicate precision. "Inspector Purbright," she said softly, "I trust your examination is productive?" "It is illuminating," he replied, noting the slight tension in her posture. "I am particularly attentive to the ways in which actions, however small, reflect intention. Even the simplest gestures may carry meaning beyond their immediate purpose." She nodded, her expression unreadable, and returned to her work, leaving a faint trail of movement that traced the perimeter of the garden. Purbright observed the traces of her passage, small indentations in gravel, a slight brushing aside of fallen petals, and a fleeting disruption of the morning dew. These, he considered, were the marks of conscientious attention, yet in combination with the nocturnal song, they suggested a consciousness of observation itself. His attention returned to the rose trellis, where he noted a slight irregularity in the alignment of a supporting stake. It was subtle, the sort of detail easily overlooked, yet it hinted at deliberate adjustment, perhaps the act of someone seeking to maintain appearances, or perhaps to signal awareness of scrutiny. He traced the line of the garden path with his gaze, noting the faintest impression of repeated passage near the magnolia bench. The pattern, quiet and understated, suggested intention rather than accident. As he continued his perambulation, Purbright reflected upon the interplay of observation and social expectation. The convent's routine, the committee's concern, and the minor disturbances in the garden all formed a network of subtle signals, each informing the other. In small communities, he reflected, the moral landscape was as exacting as any garden, requiring constant attention, precise adjustment, and a vigilant eye. Even the most benign act, a song, a flower rearranged, could acquire significance when interpreted through the lens of expectation and reputation. He paused near the far corner of the garden, where a small patch of lavender had been slightly displaced. The soil bore the faint impression of a shoe, a footprint smaller than any he had observed in previous inspections. It suggested either a youthful step or a deliberate attempt to leave a subtle mark without attracting attention. Purbright crouched, observing the orientation and depth of the impression, noting the direction of approach and the possible timing relative to the canticle. It was a minor detail, almost insignificant, yet in his experience, such minutiae often revealed more than overt testimony. Returning toward the magnolia bench, he noticed Sister Beatrice standing silently, her gaze fixed upon the distant horizon. "You have noted much," she said, her voice calm, "yet there remains the question of purpose. Observation, intention, and consequence often intertwined in ways that elude immediate comprehension." Purbright inclined his head. "Indeed, the garden, the committee, the song, they form a network of subtle communication. It is not always clear whether the message is intended, interpreted, or merely reflected." He allowed a brief pause, letting the observation rest. "And yet, as with all communication, even unintentional signals carry weight." She regarded him for a moment, eyes steady, before turning to attend a nearby flower bed. Her measured composure suggested awareness without disclosure, acknowledgement without concession. Purbright, observing the small adjustments she made to the plants, considered the possibility that these movements were themselves part of the network he was beginning to trace, a language of gestures, patterns, and placement parallel to the canticle, but expressed in silence. As he rose to depart, a sudden glint caught his eye, a small fragment of paper, almost imperceptible, among the stones of the gravel path, bearing a faint pencil mark. It was trivial in appearance, a scribble perhaps, but the positioning suggested it had been left deliberately, either by the performer of the song or by an attentive observer. He picked it up carefully, noting its slight weight and the careful pressure of the pencil. It was insufficient to reveal content without further examination, yet it promised a clue, subtle and understated, for future consideration. Purbright left the garden with a measured pace, reflecting on the morning's observations. The canticle, he realized, functioned on multiple levels, as a personal ritual, as a reflection upon communal expectation, and perhaps increasingly as a subtle instrument of signaling. The minor disturbances, the footprints, and the faint pencil mark suggested deliberate attention, a consciousness of observation that extended beyond mere melody. The community, he thought dryly, was more adept at self-scrutiny than it realized, and the convent, its gardens and its routines, served as both mirror and canvas. As he walked along the cloister, the early sunlight glinting off the dew-laden petals, Purbright's thoughts settled on a single question, unspoken yet insistent. Was the midnight song intended solely for reflection, or had it become, through pattern, timing and observation, a subtle communication aimed at revealing gently or otherwise the latent anxieties and rivalries of the parish? The question lingered, quiet and deliberate, as he retraced his steps toward the village, carrying with him the fragment of paper and the faint impression of intention that would guide the next phase of his investigation. Inspector Purbright arrived at Mrs. Liddell's house shortly after the appointed hour, summoned under the pretext of a donor's tea, though he had learned to suspect that in small towns any social gathering masked layers of observation and subtle negotiation. The drawing-room was arranged with fastidious attention to symmetry, armchairs positioned at precise angles, lace antimacassars ironed to geometric perfection, and a carpet that seemed impervious to accidental intrusion. Purbright noted the faint aroma of polished wood and Earl Grey, a scent designed to soothe, to impress, and perhaps to signal refinement. Mrs. Liddell greeted him with her usual measured smile, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of social authority. "Inspector," she said, inclining her head, "you honour us with your presence. The others will be arriving presently. I trust your morning was instructive?" "Indeed," Purbright replied, allowing a faint trace of dry amusement to colour his tone. "The morning reveals subtleties not always apparent at other hours. One observes patterns in both flora and human comportment alike." He allowed the words to rest. Mrs. Liddell inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the dual application of his observation. The first arrivals were the regular donors, all women of impeccable manners and delicate air. Their arrival staggered to permit individual introductions and subtle appraisal. Each carried a sense of purpose, though none would have admitted it openly. They were auditors of propriety, quietly evaluating the convent, its nuns, and, as Purbright suspected, one another. A faint undercurrent of rivalry passed between Mrs. Penhaligon and Miss Stroud, discernible only in the careful calibration of their smiles and the slight adjustment of handkerchiefs. Tea was served with ceremony, sugar cubes placed in a tiny dish, spoons aligned parallel, and porcelain cups positioned precisely on saucers. Conversation began in a tone of gentle civility, commentary upon parish fundraising, the weather, and recent donations to the choir. Yet Purbright detected the soft inflections and pauses that betrayed concern for reputation. Every compliment was carefully measured, every observation hedged with qualification. "The convent's garden is most remarkable," Mrs. Penhaligon remarked, her eyes flicking subtly toward Mrs. Liddell. "One cannot help noticing the dedication involved in its upkeep. It is illustrative, in some sense, of the discipline within." "Indeed," Purbright interjected softly. "And yet discipline, while admirable, often produces patterns that invite observation." His phrasing was neutral yet sufficiently pointed to highlight the duality of perception. The garden, like the convent, was both object and mirror. Miss Stroud inclined her head, lips pressed together. "It is remarkable, certainly," she murmured, "though one wonders if attention to such details might influence— oh, I do not mean to suggest impertinence— the impressions one leaves upon the community." Her careful phrasing allowed suggestion without accusation, the subtle art of insinuation perfected over many years of tea-room diplomacy. Purbright noted with faint amusement how the discussion had shifted from flowers and virtue to impressions and intention. He allowed a moment of silence, permitting the undercurrent of tension to manifest without overt comment. In small communities, he reflected, civility was often the most precise instrument of judgment. Mrs. Liddell poured another cup of tea, placing it before the inspector with deliberate exactitude. "You will forgive our prudence," she said. "The committee is diligent, as are the donors. We all take seriously the responsibility of observation, though naturally we do so with the utmost courtesy." "I understand entirely," Purbright replied. "Observation is rarely neutral. Even a polite remark may carry the weight of expectation or reproach. And in small towns one learns that civility often functions as subtle regulation." Conversation returned to the canticle, though it was framed delicately, each speaker careful not to overtly suggest impropriety. Mrs. Penhaligon spoke of the song's ethereal quality, while simultaneously noting its tendency to coincide with parish events. Miss Stroud hinted at the unintentional illumination of patterns within the convent hierarchy. Every phrase was crafted to suggest concern while preserving decorum, a verbal choreography mirroring the garden paths outside. Purbright noted a subtle alteration in Mrs. Liddell's posture when the discussion turned to timing. Her hands, previously resting calmly, clasped the teacup with a faint tightening of the fingers. The gesture, almost imperceptible, indicated awareness of influence and perhaps minor apprehension at the potential implications of her own framing of events. He sipped his tea, allowing the observation to settle, and then asked softly, "Do the donors, I wonder, perceive the song as commentary or merely as reflection?" A faint murmur passed among the guests. Mrs. Penhaligon's eyes met Mrs. Liddell's briefly, a silent acknowledgement of shared discretion. "Perhaps both," Mrs. Liddell said finally, her tone even, her voice carrying the weight of authority. "Or the effect upon perception is rarely singular. One action, even intended as private devotion, may reveal patterns, loyalties, or minor rivalries one did not intend to disclose." The statement was measured, yet it carried a hint of insight that intrigued Purbright. The canticle, he reflected, had evolved beyond melody into a subtle instrument of social observation. It elicited response, cultivated reflection, and revealed tensions, all without overt instruction or interference. The donors, in turn, participated not merely as witnesses but as interpreters, their polite scrutiny shaping the very meaning of the act they observed. A brief silence followed, broken only by the clink of teaspoons against porcelain. Purbright's gaze wandered toward the window overlooking the convent garden. The morning sun highlighted the faint indentation in the gravel, the slight misalignment of a trellis stake, and a single petal that lay delicately displaced. Each minor anomaly, insignificant in isolation, suggested deliberate attention or signaling. He made a mental note. The intersection of observation, intention, and reception was forming a pattern, faint yet consistent. "Inspector," Mrs. Liddell said after a pause, "you perceive much, perhaps more than we ourselves acknowledge. It is remarkable how attention magnifies influence, even in the most polite of communities." "Indeed," Purbright replied, "and in such magnification, even the smallest gestures acquire significance. The canticle, for example, is less a solitary act than a reflection upon social conscience. Its melody resonates not only in the air, but within the attentiveness of all who hear or contemplate it." The guests murmured polite agreement, their expressions carefully neutral, though Purbright detected a faint trace of self-awareness in the posture of each. The tea had become an arena of subtle self-scrutiny, a microcosm of the parish itself. Every gesture, glance, and carefully hedged remark contributed to an intricate web of reputation, perception, and expectation. As the gathering began to conclude, Purbright observed a minor yet suggestive detail, a faint smudge upon the edge of Mrs. Penhaligon's napkin, almost imperceptible, as if she had brushed against something in passing. he made a subtle note in his mind, recognizing that minor marks often revealed more than formal testimony. Similarly, the careful arrangement of sugar cubes and cups suggested attention to decorum that bordered on performance, a signal perhaps as deliberate as any spoken word. He took his leave with measured civility, Mrs. Liddell accompanying him to the door. "You will, of course, keep our observations confidential," she said softly, "though I suspect you are quite capable of interpreting them judiciously." "Confidentiality is always observed," Purbright replied, "yet interpretation is essential to understanding both act and consequence." He inclined his head and departed, the faint aroma of tea and polished wood lingering in the air, as if the room itself had retained a subtle imprint of social negotiation. Walking back along the village street, Purbright reflected on the morning's events. The canticle, the garden, and the polite scrutiny of the donors had coalesced into a discernible network of influence and observation. The song's significance was not in sound alone, but in the interplay of attention, expectation, and subtle signalling. The community, he reflected dryly, was far more adept at self-surveillance than any outsider might assume. A final observation occupied him as he approached the convent gate, a small scrap of paper caught among the gravel near the magnolia bench, partially hidden beneath a fallen leaf. He paused, noting the faint pencil marks along its surface, the deliberate placement suggesting either inadvertent drop or intentional signalling. The fragment, trivial as it appeared, promised further insight into the patterns he was beginning to discern. He retrieved it carefully, slipping it into his notebook for later examination. The chapter closed with a subtle, insistent question hovering in Purbright's mind. Were the donor's polite remarks and the nun's measured movements mere reflection of communal expectations, or had the canticle, through timing, pattern, and observation, become a subtle instrument of commentary revealing the latent hierarchies, anxieties, and rivalries of the parish itself? The question, unspoken yet tangible, would guide his next visit. The morning was unusually still, the kind of quiet that seemed almost conspiratorial, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Inspector Purbright arrived at the parish hall with the sense that the day's observation would yield insight not merely into the canticle, but into the subtle interplay of hierarchy and reputation surrounding it. Today he would witness the rehearsal of the choir, conducted under the watchful eyes of both Sister Beatrice and selected members of the parish committee, a confluence of authority and scrutiny that promised delicate revelations. Inside the hall, the nuns were arranged with meticulous attention, a line of benches parallel to the windows, hymnals held precisely, and postures calibrated to express both reverence and composure. The committee members occupied chairs along the opposite wall, their expressions polite yet taut, as if the slightest inflection in pitch or gesture might betray the underlying social dynamics. Purbright observed with mild amusement the careful choreography of expectation that governed both sides, the choir performing, the committee evaluating, and all parties maintaining a veneer of civility. "Inspector Purbright," Sister Beatrice said softly, glancing toward him, "we appreciate your presence. The young ladies are accustomed to routine observation, though the committee's scrutiny is somewhat novel." Her choice of phrasing, polite and understated, carried the faintest trace of amusement. Purbright inclined his head. Observation, when practiced with discipline, often reveals patterns invisible to casual notice. I find that these patterns may illuminate not only the act itself, but the surrounding social environment. The rehearsal commenced with deliberate formality, each note precise, each pause intentional. Purbright noted how the timing of the canticle, once a simple ritual, now coincided subtly with committee meetings and parish gatherings, producing an effect that might be construed as commentary rather than mere devotion. The young nuns, though technically adept, occasionally hesitated at certain phrases, their eyes flicking toward the observers as if measuring reception. Mrs. Penhaligon, seated near the front, murmured softly to Miss Stroud, "Notice how the cadence changes precisely as the vicar enters the hall. It is almost suggestive." Her voice carried no accusation, only observation, yet the phrasing implied awareness of intention. Purbright noted this, recording silently that even minor shifts in performance were interpreted as deliberate signals, a reflection of the committee's own anxieties and attentiveness. Sister Margaret, the youngest of the choir, faltered briefly during a high note. Her eyes darted toward Sister Beatrice, then to the committee members, a fleeting flash of apprehension passing across her features. Purbright made a careful note. Such micro-expressions, though minute, offered insight into the intersection of duty, performance, and perception. The canticle, while ostensibly musical, functioned as a prism refracting communal expectation and latent judgment. "Miss Callender," Purbright said quietly during a pause, "would you describe how the presence of the committee affects your attention to performance?" Miss Callender inclined her head with deliberate composure. "It is instructive, sir. One is conscious of scrutiny, yet it does not diminish devotion. Rather, it heightens awareness of tone, timing, and the manner in which one's conduct is perceived. The audience, even if polite, cannot be disregarded entirely." "Indeed," Purbright murmured, noting the careful phrasing, acknowledgement without complaint, observation without challenge. The act itself remains constant, yet perception magnifies its significance. A melody, repeated nightly, may become both instrument and commentary. The committee observed with the utmost restraint, though their attention was far from idle. Miss Stroud adjusted her spectacles and made a slight notation in a small leather-bound notebook, while Mrs. Liddell's fingers tapped lightly against the arm of her chair, suggesting careful calculation. Even minor gestures, Purbright noted, were freighted with meaning, approval, doubt, or tacit criticism, expressed without breach of civility. After the rehearsal concluded, the committee and choir retired to separate corners of the hall for informal discussion. Purbright took the opportunity to speak privately with Sister Beatrice. "Do you believe the young ladies perceive the observation as supportive or intrusive?" he asked, his tone neutral, inviting reflection rather than direct answer. She considered for a moment. "It varies. Some welcome scrutiny, interpreting it as affirmation of purpose. Others, particularly those aware of social expectation beyond the convent, experience mild anxiety. Yet all maintain decorum, understanding that perception itself has weight." Her phrasing was precise, reflecting awareness of both the musical and psychological dimensions of the situation. Returning to the committee, Purbright engaged in gentle inquiry. "Do you perceive the canticle as commentary or reflection?" he asked, phrasing the question carefully to avoid leading or presuming intent. Mrs. Penhaligon inclined her head. "A mixture of both, I suspect. The act illuminates not only devotion, but also patterns of attention and hierarchy. One cannot fully separate observation from inference." Miss Stroud nodded in silent agreement, her lips pressed in the faintest approximation of a smile. Purbright allowed the moment of reflection to linger, noting the subtle shifts in posture and gaze that betrayed each participant's awareness of the social lattice in which they were embedded. The rehearsal had become an arena of scrutiny, not only of musical skill, but of propriety, attention, and latent ambition. During a brief pause, Purbright observed Sister Agnes moving quietly along the perimeter, adjusting hymnals and straightening benches. Her movements were so subtle as to seem incidental, yet the precision suggested conscious signaling, maintenance of order, affirmation of hierarchy, or acknowledgement of observation. Each small act, he considered, was imbued with multiple layers of meaning. He traced the pattern of glances among committee members, noting micro-shifts in alignment, the adjustment of hands, and the minute tilts of heads. These gestures, while insignificant in isolation, collectively formed a narrative of concern, approval, or subtle critique. In small communities, he reflected, social meaning often resides not in words but in the carefully measured body language that accompanies them. A minor incident drew his attention. A hymn book, momentarily misaligned on a bench, was gently corrected by Sister Beatrice. The act was almost imperceptible, yet the committee members observed the adjustment with a faint lift of eyebrows or subtle nod, as though acknowledging the intentionality behind the correction. Purbright noted it as a demonstration of the delicate interplay between performance, observation, and social expectation. Later, as the committee retired to a side room for discussion, Purbright examined the margins of Miss Stroud's notebook, discovering faint pencil marks that appeared to correspond with minor variations in the rehearsal's cadence. It suggested careful attention, perhaps even deliberate notation of perceived deviations, a pattern of observation designed to be discreet yet precise. The inspector considered that these subtle records might illuminate not only performance but the committee's interpretive lens, revealing priorities, anxieties, and potential biases. The final observation of the morning occurred as Purbright returned to the hall's main space. A small scrap of parchment lay partially concealed beneath a bench near the window, edges folded with care. He picked it up, noting faint pencil markings that hinted at musical notation or perhaps timing cues. It was difficult to interpret without context, yet its deliberate placement suggested communication, subtle and understated. The fragment promised a clue almost imperceptible, yet weighted with potential significance for the investigation. As he departed, Purbright reflected on the convergence of acts, observation, and perception. The canticle had begun as a simple devotional practice, yet through repeated observation, committee scrutiny, and subtle signaling, it had evolved into a medium through which social anxieties, latent rivalries, and unspoken hierarchies were illuminated. Each participant, whether performer or observer, contributed to a layered narrative whose significance transcended melody. Walking through the village streets, the inspector noted the interplay of sunlight and shadow upon shop windows, the faint echoes of morning activity, and the occasional glimmer of attention directed toward the convent from passing pedestrians. Small towns, he reflected, operated on observation as much as action. Every gesture, every glance, every carefully placed mark contributed to the community's understanding of itself and of its members. Purbright pocketed the parchment, considering its implications. The morning had revealed that the canticle functioned not merely as sound but as message, not only as devotion but as reflection, and perhaps subtly as commentary. Each note, each pause, each carefully observed gesture within the hall had been amplified by scrutiny, magnifying minor irregularities into points of significance. The chapter concluded with a subtle shift. As he passed the convent gates, Purbright noted a shadow moving behind the upper windows, distinct from the ordinary motions of the nuns. The figure lingered, as though observing both the garden and the village beyond, and then vanished with the same quiet deliberation that had marked every minor action he had witnessed that morning. A question hovered in his mind, almost imperceptible but persistent. Was the shadow a mere observer or a participant in the complex interplay of signals and perception that had come to define the canticle's nocturnal presence? Inspector Purbright arrived at the parish office just as the morning sun began to tilt across the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like careful witnesses to the quiet proceedings. The room, lined with filing cabinets and neat stacks of parish correspondence, exuded an air of order, yet beneath its surface was the subtle energy of social vigilance. Purbright knew from years of observing small-town bureaucracy that letters and notes, so often dismissed as trivial, were repositories of moral anxiety, latent judgment, and subtle manipulation. Today he intended to examine them with deliberate care. Mrs. Liddell greeted him with her habitual poise, though there was a faint tension in the angle of her shoulders. "Inspector," she said, inclining her head, "I have gathered the correspondence and committee minutes as you requested. I trust they will prove informative." Her choice of adverb was precise, signalling both assistance and mild apprehension about the scrutiny his inspection might bring. "Your diligence is appreciated," Purbright replied. "I am primarily interested in understanding the manner in which perception has been recorded and the ways in which concerns, however polite, have been articulated." He began with the committee minutes, noting the careful phrasing that avoided overt accusation, yet chronicled suspicion with meticulous subtlety. Phrases such as "the timing of nocturnal musical occurrences invites reflection" and "one might consider the implications upon communal perception" exemplified the delicate craft of social notation. Every entry was suffused with indirect commentary, polite yet incisive, revealing the committee's preoccupation with both propriety and hierarchy. Mrs. Liddell poured tea with the exactitude of someone accustomed to ritual, and Purbright observed the slight tremor in her hand as she lifted the pot. He noted the unspoken tension. The intersection of public duty and private apprehension often produced minor physiological betrayals, as revealing as the written word itself. Turning to the letters, he found a similar pattern. Parishioners expressed admiration for Sister Beatrice's devotion, coupled with careful observation of the canticle's timing and effect. A letter from Mrs. Penhaligon contained a paragraph praising the ethereal quality of the music, immediately followed by a suggestion that perhaps the melody might be rendered earlier in the evening. The juxtaposition was deliberate, admiration tempered by caution, and the polite imposition of expectation disguised as helpful counsel. Purbright made careful notes, recognizing the layered intent. The letters functioned as instruments of social calibration, each sentence a measure of concern, deference, and subtle judgment. In small communities, he reflected, moral surveillance was often exercised through written words, whose civility disguised scrutiny, whose politeness amplified influence. Miss Stroud's letter, he observed, exhibited similar craftsmanship, though with a slightly sharper edge. She inquired after the convent's internal routines and hinted at the potential for minor disruption of parish events. The phrasing was impeccable, the critique invisible at first glance, yet sufficiently precise to guide attention and prompt reflection. He noted the careful repetition of certain words, consideration, effect, attention, which served as markers of concern without overt accusation. Sister Beatrice entered quietly, her presence serene, yet attentive. "I trust your examination is proceeding without inconvenience," she said softly, offering no elaboration. Her eyes, however, betrayed a measured curiosity, an awareness that the inspector was tracing patterns not only of letters and minutes, but of communal consciousness itself. "None at all," Purbright replied. "It is remarkable how much the written word reveals, even when crafted with utmost civility. Observation, expectation, and intention are embedded within every phrase." He allowed a pause, letting the point settle. "And in your case, Sister Beatrice, the effect extends beyond text into perception, pattern, and social consequence." She inclined her head faintly, her expression neutral but precise, acknowledging the observation without conceding intrusion. The convent, he thought, was a locus of intention, each member conscious of the audience both within and beyond its walls. The letters and minutes were reflections of communal attention, yet the convent itself was a participant, subtly shaping perception through ritual, placement, and comportment. Purbright returned to the correspondence, noting a minor anomaly. A folded scrap of paper slipped between the pages of a committee minute, bearing a faint pencil mark. The mark was minimal, almost imperceptible, yet its placement suggested deliberate concealment. Was it a note for private reflection, an internal signal, or an attempt at covert commentary? The ambiguity itself was a clue emblematic of the layered communication he had observed throughout the investigation. He traced the path of handwriting, noting minute variations in pressure, slight hesitations in stroke, and occasional underlining of words. These, he reflected, were almost imperceptible signals of emphasis, revealing the writer's attention and subtle judgment. In a town such as this, small deviations conveyed meaning more powerfully than overt statements. Moral surveillance operated invisibly, its instruments silence, ink, and glance. During a pause, Sister Beatrice gestured toward the window overlooking the convent garden. "The garden itself," she said softly, "often mirrors the nuances you trace in correspondence. Actions, however minor, may reflect intention and invite interpretation. Both the physical and social landscapes are susceptible to observation." Purbright inclined his head, considering the subtle equivalence she suggested. Indeed, the garden had already yielded impressions of attention, care, and signalling, footprints in gravel, minor displacements of petals, faint adjustments to benches and trellises. The letters and committee minutes now appeared as extensions of this same language, each sentence, each careful omission or emphasis, functioning as silent choreography. Mrs. Liddell, observing his scrutiny, remarked in her customary measured tone, "The interplay of observation and duty is delicate. One must exercise care lest concern become intrusion, or civility be mistaken for neglect." She allowed a brief pause, eyes meeting Purbright's. Yet sometimes even the most benign observation carries weight beyond intention. Purbright made a mental note of her phrasing. Indeed, the inspector had already observed how civility could disguise critique, how small gestures, foot placement, posture, or the adjustment of an inked note could convey layered meaning. Moral surveillance, he reflected, was most potent when silent, embedded within routine, and reinforced by communal expectation. He returned to the folded scrap of paper, carefully unfolding it. Faint pencil markings suggested timing notes, possibly correlating musical cues with committee visits or parish events. The fragment was insufficient to provide certainty, yet its deliberate concealment indicated conscious awareness of observation, a trace of agency extending the canticle's influence into written form. He placed it carefully in his notebook, recognizing it as a clue of understated significance, capable of guiding future inquiry. Purbright's gaze drifted toward the window once more, noting the garden's subtle irregularities, a petal slightly displaced, a faint indentation in the soil near the magnolia bench, the minor misalignment of a trellis stake. Each detail seemed to echo the correspondence, deliberate, yet understated, intentional, yet presented as incidental. The convergence of text and environment suggested a network of subtle signaling in which observation, perception, and social consequence were entwined. The inspector allowed himself a moment of reflection, noting that the parish letters and committee minutes, though courteous, conveyed more than their words alone. They revealed hierarchy, anxiety, and latent competition encoded in phrasing, punctuation, and omission. Combined with his garden observations, they suggested a deliberately constructed web of influence, one in which even minor deviations could attract attention and interpretation. As he prepared to leave, a faint sound reached his attention, the distant toll of the convent bell, measured and deliberate. The cadence, though routine, seemed to carry a note of awareness, a gentle signal that action and observation were mutually acknowledged. Purbright noted it with interest, pondering the interplay of ritual, perception, and communication. He stepped outside into the soft morning light, the village streets quiet and attentive in their usual understated manner. Each pedestrian, each bird call, and each glint of sun on glass seemed, in the inspector's imagination, to participate in the same network of observation that permeated the parish hall, the garden, and the correspondence. Even trivialities, he reflected, were laden with meaning when interpreted through the lens of communal consciousness. The chapter concluded with a subtle, persistent question. Had the canticle and its attendant signals been entirely spontaneous, or was there a deliberate orchestration linking musical performance, garden ritual, and carefully crafted correspondence to guide perception, reveal anxieties, and subtly manipulate reputations? The folded scrap of paper, now safely secured in his notebook, was the first tangible hint that the answer might lie not in melody alone, but in the convergence of action, observation, and understated commentary. The mid-morning air was still, though the village streets carried a subtle hum of activity, as if the ordinary movements of market stalls and bakeries were faintly aware of the underlying tensions that Purbright had been tracing. He arrived at the parish hall under the pretext of a follow-up regarding committee concerns, yet the inspector was keenly aware that today's visit would involve more than routine inquiry. He had noted the growing intersections of observation, performance, and written commentary. Now he hoped to discern the social undercurrents that connected donor influence to the convent's choir. Inside, Mrs. Liddell was already receiving visitors, her composure immaculate, her smile balanced on the knife edge of authority and anxious propriety. Purbright observed the careful choreography of her gestures, the precise tilt of a head, the faint inclination of a teacup toward a guest, the meticulous spacing of chairs to allow conversation without overt intrusion. Such minute calibrations, he reflected, were themselves instruments of influence, silently conveying approval, expectation, or subtle warning. "Inspector Purbright," she said, inclining her head, "the committee has requested your presence to discuss certain observations. I trust your morning is proceeding satisfactorily." "Indeed," he replied, his tone neutral, but carrying the faintest trace of dry amusement. Observations are most instructive when viewed in context. Patterns emerge when one compares ritual, correspondence, and conduct. The committee members were already seated along the side of the hall, each demonstrating the equilibrium of civility. Mrs. Penhaligon and Miss Stroud exchanged barely perceptible glances, their hands poised on laps or teacups in a manner that suggested vigilance rather than leisure. Purbright noted with interest the micro-shifts in posture, a slight lean forward, a fractional tilt of the head, the soft tapping of fingers, all subtle indices of attention, approval, or quiet concern. Discussion began with the canticle, though framed in the customary layer of politeness. Mrs. Penhaligon remarked on its continuing refinement, while Miss Stroud noted that the timing of nocturnal performances coincided rather precisely with parish committees' visits. Each phrase, though civil, carried latent observation and implied expectation. The song was no longer merely devotional, it was in effect a medium through which communal attention and judgment were exercised. Purbright's gaze shifted toward the choir members seated respectfully along a bench. Sister Margaret and Miss Callender exchanged brief glances, as though measuring the audience's reaction to their measured performance. Each minor adjustment of posture, each careful alignment of hymnals, seemed to acknowledge the multiple layers of scrutiny that now accompanied their nightly canticle. "Inspector," Mrs. Liddell said softly, "there is a concern that minor irregularities, though unintentional, may influence perception more than merit dictates. The committee seeks clarity as to whether observation has revealed patterns meriting attention." Purbright inclined his head. Patterns, he said, exist almost inevitably where attention is focused. Minor variations amplified by observation may acquire significance beyond intention. The challenge is discerning whether these variations constitute deviation or are simply reflections of human diligence. Mrs. Penhaligon's fingers tapped lightly against the table. "It is precisely that ambiguity," she murmured, "which causes some anxiety. One wishes to ensure that neither perception nor suggestion inadvertently guides judgment beyond what is warranted." Her phrasing was impeccable, an acknowledgement of responsibility couched in civility, masking the quiet anxiety that underpinned her attention. Purbright allowed the silence to linger. In small communities, he reflected, anxiety was often disguised by courtesy. Critique was softened into careful phrasing, and influence was exercised through implication rather than directive. Even minor gestures, adjustments of hymnals, a glance at a footstep, the alignment of teacups, carried weight. The discussion then shifted to donor influence. Miss Stroud, in her customary measured tone, inquired about the intersection of contributions and expectations. "One wonders," she said, "if the generosity of certain parishioners subtly guides comportment, or if the observant recipients merely anticipate expectations that are, in truth, unarticulated." Purbright observed her carefully, noting the precision of her phrasing. The question was framed to appear speculative, yet it suggested an acute awareness of power dynamics. Mrs. Liddell responded with customary poise. "Attention is indeed shaped by perception, yet it is difficult to determine whether action arises from explicit expectation or the innate desire to maintain propriety within the community. The subtle interplay of social expectation and quiet influence became increasingly evident. Donor contributions, while ostensibly benign, appeared to carry unspoken obligations. The timing of canticles, the arrangement of choristers, and even the alignment of chairs all seemed to reflect anticipation of approval or gentle correction. Purbright noted with mild fascination how the threads of influence, garden observation, committee scrutiny, and correspondence now intersected with the tangible presence of benefactors, weaving an intricate lattice of expectation and subtle pressure. During a lull, the inspector observed a minor yet telling incident. Sister Agnes, attending to minor adjustments of hymnals, briefly paused to glance toward Mrs. Penhaligon, her movement so slight as to be almost imperceptible. Yet the tilt of her head and the minute hesitation suggested a consciousness of attention and perhaps even tacit signaling, acknowledgement of observation without overt disclosure. Such gestures, Purbright reflected, were among the most revealing. Intention often left its mark in silence, more so than in speech. He then turned to examine the committee notes laid on the table. Marginal annotations suggested careful observation of both musical execution and behavioral subtleties. One note in particular caught his attention. A brief comment in pencil, almost invisible unless closely inspected, noting the precise timing of a high note in relation to a parish council member's entrance. The precision implied deliberate attention, perhaps even a subtle form of signalling, a faint whisper of orchestration in a landscape dominated by civility. Mrs. Liddell, observing his scrutiny, remarked gently, "You are most thorough, Inspector. One forgets how much is recorded even when no words are spoken aloud. Observation carries its own weight." Purbright inclined his head. "Indeed, the convergence of note, gesture, and perception forms a network of information whose significance is often underestimated. Even minor acts, placement of a hymn, adjustment of a bench, the tilt of a head, may function as communication, whether intentional or inferred." He allowed himself a quiet moment to trace the patterns he had observed. Garden irregularities, nocturnal canticles, committee scrutiny, letters, donor influence, and now the micro-movements of choristers and attentive observers. Each element, minor in isolation, contributed to a lattice of attention, expectation, and latent pressure. The small town operated, he reflected dryly, on observation as much as on morality or ritual. Every act was both performed and received, evaluated and internalized, often without conscious acknowledgement. As the meeting concluded, Purbright noticed a subtle, almost imperceptible detail. A small fragment of parchment slipped between the pages of the committee notebook, previously unnoticed. Its edges were folded with care, bearing faint marks in pencil that seemed to correspond to musical timing, yet there was an additional line that hinted at attention to social behavior, the movement of particular individuals within the hall. He retrieved it cautiously, sensing that this fragment, trivial as it appeared, might illuminate the coordination between performance and observation he had been tracing for weeks. Stepping into the soft afternoon light, Purbright reflected on the implications. The canticle, while melodic and devotional, had evolved into a vehicle for social calibration. Each gesture, glance, note, and written remark contributed to a network of signaling that shaped behavior, perception, and expectation. Donor influence, committee observation, and the careful choreography of the convent's daily life were now linked in a subtle yet discernible pattern. The chapter concluded with a quiet, insistent question: was the nocturnal canticle a spontaneous act of devotion, or had it, through repeated observation, careful performance and deliberate signaling, become a mechanism for guiding perception, revealing hierarchy, and influencing reputations? The small fragment of parchment, folded and annotated with discretion, promised to provide the first tangible indication of deliberate orchestration, yet left its full significance tantalizingly out of reach, lingering as a whisper of intent for Purbright to pursue. Inspector Purbright arrived at the convent as the late afternoon sun softened across the courtyard, casting long, deliberate shadows that seemed to emphasize the geometry of order and the minor anomalies within it. He carried the small fragment of parchment discovered the previous day, along with his notebook filled with observations, sketches, and marginal notes. The air was calm, yet the very stillness seemed conspiratorial. In a village like this, silence carried as much meaning as conversation. Sister Beatrice greeted him at the entrance, her composure perfect, though Purbright noted the slight tension in the set of her shoulders. "Inspector," she said, inclining her head, "you are most punctual. The young ladies have completed their afternoon tasks, though I trust your visit is primarily for observation." "Observation is always best conducted in the natural flow of routine," Purbright replied. "I am interested in understanding not only the act itself, but its context, the interrelation of pattern, attention, and perception." His tone was neutral, yet sufficiently pointed to suggest awareness of the subtle orchestration he had been tracing. The convent's common room was arranged with the usual meticulousness, hymnals aligned in perfect rows, benches spaced with precision, and the faint aroma of polished wood, underscoring the atmosphere of deliberate decorum. Purbright noted the micro-adjustments of posture and gaze among the nuns, subtle acknowledgments that he had become an expected observer in their rhythm. Sister Margaret approached him quietly, holding a hymnal with careful respect. "Inspector," she said softly, "I have a question about the fragment you discovered. Do you believe it was intended for you?" Her tone was measured, betraying neither anxiety nor curiosity, yet the choice of words carried the faintest edge of intrigue. "Perhaps," Purbright replied, accepting the ambiguity. "Or perhaps it was intended for another, with the expectation that observation would eventually reveal its purpose. In matters of perception, intent is often as layered as execution." Sister Margaret inclined her head, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Even in the absence of overt communication, the nuns exhibited a subtle choreography of acknowledgement, a shared rhythm of awareness that underscored the complex social lattice of duty, expectation, and propriety. Purbright turned his attention to the fragment, unfolding it carefully on the table. Pencil marks indicated timing cues, minor annotations regarding placement within the canticle, and, faintly, references to the movement of particular individuals, committee members, donors, and nuns alike. The markings were discreet, yet deliberate, as if intended to guide perception subtly, orchestrating the interplay of performance and observation without overt direction. He traced the annotations with his eyes, noting a curious sequence. A small symbol that repeated at intervals corresponding with the entrance or exit of committee members during rehearsals. This, he considered, suggested deliberate signalling, an attempt to coordinate the effect of the canticle upon observers, to highlight attention, or perhaps to cultivate particular impressions of diligence and propriety. Mrs. Liddell entered quietly, bearing a tray with tea and biscuits. She paused upon noticing the fragment. "Inspector," she said with gentle precision, "I had not expected you to examine such minor details so meticulously. Yet it appears the significance lies precisely in what might seem trivial." Her eyes, briefly meeting his, carried an unspoken acknowledgement. The truth of subtle orchestration often resided in what most would overlook. "I find that the trivial often reveals more than the grandiose," Purbright replied, "especially in communities governed by observation, civility, and reputation." As tea was poured and placed upon the table, Purbright allowed himself a moment to observe the interactions. Sister Agnes adjusted hymnals with a deliberate care, occasionally glancing toward Mrs. Liddell and the windows, as if measuring potential observation. Sister Margaret shifted her gaze between the fragment and the room, her composure perfect, yet suggesting an awareness of both audience and expectation. Even minor gestures, tilts of the head, subtle placement of hands, were imbued with layered meaning. He asked softly, "Sister Beatrice, do you perceive that the canticle functions primarily as devotion, or has it evolved into a vehicle for guidance of perception?" She considered, her hands clasped before her. "Both, Inspector. The act remains devotional, yet we are aware that observation by parishioners, donors, and committee members inevitably shapes its reception. One cannot deny the influence of audience, however subtle. Even silence or pause communicates, and even the most private act may be interpreted as commentary." Purbright inclined his head, noting the careful phrasing. The acknowledgement of dual function, ritual, and signalling was consistent with his own observations of garden patterns, committee scrutiny, and correspondence. The canticle, he reflected, was a medium of layered intent, melody, timing, and minor gestures, all operating in concert to convey meaning beyond sound. A faint movement at the window drew his attention. A shadow, elongated and deliberate, traced the edge of the glass. He observed quietly, recognizing the figure as someone from outside the convent, yet precise in timing, entering and exiting the frame in a manner that suggested attention to pattern rather than casual observation. Purbright's interest sharpened. The canticle's influence, it seemed, extended beyond those formally designated as observers, reaching into the periphery of the village's watchfulness. Sister Beatrice, noting his gaze, commented softly, "The rhythms of our days are known to those who watch, even from distance. It is not unusual for attention to extend beyond the walls of the convent." Her tone was neutral, yet the phrasing carried an implicit warning. Awareness is not bound by permission. Purbright returned to the fragment, tracing the repetition of the symbol marking attention. It suggested an awareness of external observation, the timing of the canticle, the positioning of the choir, and even the minor adjustments of the garden were potentially coordinated to elicit particular impressions from those who observed silently or at least without overt participation. The orchestration, subtle and meticulous, demonstrated the interplay of influence, perception, and social expectation he had been uncovering. Mrs. Liddell, observing the inspector's scrutiny, remarked gently, "One forgets how much effort is expended in the service of appearance. Politeness, order, and observation are themselves forms of communication, often more powerful than words." "Indeed," Purbright agreed. And in their convergence one begins to see the shape of intention. The canticle, the minor adjustments, and even the written notes form a network through which perception and reputation are shaped deliberately. The trivial, as you suggested, reveals far more than the conspicuous. He allowed a moment of silence to settle, noting the calm attention of the nuns and the faint anticipation in Mrs. Liddell's posture. All participants were conscious of layers of observation, observer observing, observed aware of observation, and even secondary observers attending to the first. The village itself, he reflected, participated in this lattice of attention, each resident a potential witness to the carefully cultivated choreography of signal, gesture, and perception. As the visit drew to a close, Purbright rose to leave. He gathered the fragment and his notebook, noting one final detail. A subtle indentation upon the table's surface, barely perceptible, suggesting that the fragment had been pressed into place intentionally. A gesture of concealment or signalling he could not yet determine, but its deliberate nature was unmistakable. Stepping into the late afternoon light, the inspector reflected on the day's observations. The canticle, once a simple expression of devotion, had evolved into an instrument of subtle influence, its reach extending through time, attention, and perception. Choir performance, committee scrutiny, donor expectations, garden patterns, correspondence, and even minor gestures formed a lattice of communication designed to shape perception, influence reputation, and signal attention without overt declaration. The chapter concluded with a quiet, insistent question lingering in Purbright's mind. To what extent was the midnight canticle an organic act of devotion, and to what extent had it become a deliberate orchestration, a carefully calibrated instrument of observation and subtle influence, intended to reveal hierarchy, guide perception, and manipulate reputations? The small fragment of parchment, folded and annotated with discretion, hinted at a motive carefully hidden within the fabric of civility itself, promising a revelation that could illuminate the quiet power dynamics that had been shaping the parish for months.